On the morning of June 7th, 1692, the sun rose over the Caribbean in a haze of pearl and copper, and the city of Port Royal began its final day. The heat came early. By 7 o'clock, the air in the harbor was already thick enough to taste salt and tar and something sweeter underneath, the scent of rum barrels sweating in warehouses that lined the waterfront like crooked teeth. Mosquitoes hung in clouds above the still water. Dogs slept in whatever shade they could find. The bells of St. Paul's Church had rung for morning prayer, and approximately nobody had gone. This was not unusual. Port Royal was not a praying city. On the long wharf that extended into the harbor, a man named John White was conducting an inventory of damaged goods from a recent storm. His ledger recorded 93 barrels of molasses, 40 hogsheads of sugar, and 17 bolts of English cloth now spotted with mildew. White was meticulous. He noted the water damage in neat columns, his handwriting small and careful, the handwriting of a man who understood that the difference between profit and ruin often lived in the third decimal place. He did not know that in approximately 4 hours his ledger would be at the bottom of the sea, and so would he. 3 streets inland, in a tavern called the Sign of the Mermaid, a prostitute whose name the records do not preserve was sleeping off the previous night's work. She shared her bed with a sailor from Bristol who had arrived 2 days earlier aboard a merchantman called the Swan and who had not yet returned to his ship. The Swan was anchored in the harbor alongside perhaps 50 other vessels, sloops and brigantines and trading ships and a handful of craft whose legal status was, at best, ambiguous. The sailor's name was Thomas, or possibly William. The sources disagree. What the sources agree on is that he and the woman were still in bed at 11:43 in the morning when the floor beneath them began to move, and that neither of them survived the next 3 minutes. In the counting house of a merchant named Louis Galdi, coins were being weighed on brass scales. The coins were Spanish pieces of 8, and they had been Spanish pieces of 8 when they left Seville, and they had been Spanish pieces of 8 when they were captured somewhere off the coast of Hispaniola by parties who preferred not to be named, and they were Spanish pieces of 8 now as they passed through Galdi's hands on their way to being exchanged for sugar and slaves and silence. The room smelled of metal and ink. Galdi was 41 years old, a French Huguenot who had fled religious persecution in his homeland, only to wash up in the one city in Christendom where religious identity mattered less than one's ability to keep accounts. He was rich. He was comfortable. He had a wife and children in a house on Queen Street. He would survive the next 3 hours by what he would later describe as a miracle, swallowed by the earth itself, buried alive, and then expelled from a fissure in the ground like a man vomited up by the island. He would live another 47 years and be buried in a churchyard in Kingston, where his tombstone would recount the story for anyone who cared to read it. But that was later. That was after. At 11:43 on the morning of June 7th, 1692, the ground beneath Port Royal began to shake, and the most wicked city in the Western world began to die. This is the story of that city, not just its death, but its life. The 40 years of lawlessness and wealth that built it, the pirates and merchants and slaves and prostitutes who filled it, the political compromise that made it possible, and the geological accident that ended it. It is the story of how a sandbar at the end of a crooked peninsula became, for a few decades, the richest and most dangerous address in the New World. It is the story of why that mattered, what it produced, and what was lost when the sea took it back. The sources for Port Royal are better than you might expect. The city was English, and the English kept records. The Royal African Company logged its slave shipments. The Admiralty logged its naval deployments. Merchants kept ledgers. Governors wrote dispatches. After the earthquake, survivors wrote testimonies. We have letters. We have legal documents. We have inventories of the dead. We have the remarkable account of a man named Emmanuel Heath, the rector of St. Paul's Church, who was in the middle of a prayer meeting when the earthquake struck, and who walked out of the collapsing building to find the sea rushing up through the street to meet him. We have archaeological evidence. The drowned city is still there, 8 to 40 feet beneath the waters of Kingston Harbor, preserved in Caribbean muck like an insect in amber. Divers have been exploring it since 1959. They have found wine bottles and pocket watches and pewter spoons and the remnants of a life that ended mid-sentence. We can reconstruct Port Royal. We can walk its streets. We can count its brothels. The records suggest at least one for every 10 residents. And we can estimate its wealth, and we can name its most famous citizens. What we cannot do is explain it entirely. The sources tell us what happened. They do not tell us what it felt like to live in a city where the rules had been suspended, where fortunes were made overnight and lost by morning, where a man might arrive a penniless sailor and leave a plantation owner, and where everyone knew, on some level, that it could not last. That knowledge is the thing that hangs over Port Royal's history. Not just the earthquake, they did not know the earthquake was coming, but the general sense that this was borrowed time, that a place built on theft could not stand forever, that wealth without law was wealth without foundation. The preachers who survived the earthquake wrote that it was divine judgment, and while we need not share their theology, we might share their instinct. Port Royal was not built to last. It was built to extract. And extraction in the end is not a foundation, but that is judgment after the fact. Before the fact, there was simply the city, the strange, improbable, wicked, glittering city. To understand how Port Royal became what it became, you have to start with the sand. The city stood on the tip of a peninsula called the Palisadoes, a narrow spit of land that curved out from the southeastern corner of Jamaica like a beckoning finger, enclosing one of the finest natural harbors in the Caribbean. The peninsula was not solid. It was a tombolo, a geological formation created by the slow accumulation of sand and coral debris, built up over thousands of years by currents and storms until it connected a small cay to the mainland. The land was low. The land was unstable. The land was, in geological terms, essentially a sandbar that had been around long enough to grow vegetation. The Spanish, who controlled Jamaica from 1509 to 1655, understood this. They built their capital at Santiago de la Vega, 7 miles inland, where the ground was solid and the elevation provided some protection against both hurricanes and raids. They used the harbor at the end of the Palisados. They called it Caguaya, but they did not build a city there. Why would they? The location was militarily exposed, geologically questionable, and offered no fresh water. The Spanish were not fools. The English were not fools either, but they had a different problem. On May the 10th, 1655, an English fleet under Admiral William Penn and General Robert Venables appeared off the coast of Jamaica. The fleet had been sent by Oliver Cromwell as part of what was called the Western Design, an ambitious and poorly planned attempt to seize Spanish territory in the Caribbean. The original target had been Hispaniola. The attack on Hispaniola had been a humiliating disaster. The English forces, badly supplied, badly led, and decimated by disease, had been repulsed by a much smaller Spanish garrison. Rather than return home empty-handed, Penn and Venables decided to attack Jamaica instead, a softer target, lightly defended, a consolation prize. They took the island in a matter of days. The Spanish colonists, outnumbered and unsupported, fled to the mountains and eventually to Cuba. Jamaica was English. The question was, now what? The answer, it turned out, was the harbor. The new English governors understood immediately that they could not hold Jamaica with the forces they had. The island was large, 4,900 square miles, and they had perhaps 2,500 soldiers, most of them sick, all of them demoralized. Spanish counterattack was not just possible, but expected. The government in London was distracted by domestic politics and could not be counted on for reinforcement. If Jamaica was going to survive as an English colony, it would need to defend itself, and to defend itself, it would need ships. The natural place for those ships was the harbor at Caguaya. Within months of the conquest, the English began fortifying the sandy point at the end of the Palisados. They built a wooden palisade. The name came from the fortification, not the geography. And they built gun platforms facing the harbor entrance. They called the settlement Point Caguay, then Caguay, and finally, as it grew, Port Royal. By 1657, a permanent garrison had been established. By 1660, a town was beginning to take shape. Crude wooden buildings, a few warehouses, the first of what would eventually become dozens of taverns. The founding of Port Royal was military necessity. What it became was something else entirely. The transformation began with a letter. In late 1657, Governor Edward D'Oyly wrote to London asking for permission to grant commissions to privateers. The logic was straightforward. England could not afford to keep a permanent naval squadron in the Caribbean, and Jamaica could not defend itself without ships. Private vessels, operating under official license, could fill the gap. They would attack Spanish shipping, disrupt Spanish commerce, and make Spanish attempts to retake the island too expensive to pursue. In exchange for legal protection and a safe harbor, they would give Jamaica a defensive fleet at no cost to the Crown. London agreed. The commissions were issued, and Port Royal began its slide into legend. The privateers who descended on Jamaica in the late 1650s and early 1660s were, in legal terms, not pirates. They carried letters of marque, official documents that authorized them to attack enemy shipping in time of war. England and Spain were at war, off and on, throughout this period. The commissions were legitimate, or at least defensible, but the men who carried them were not, for the most part, officers and gentlemen. They were adventurers, refugees, escaped servants, transported criminals, sailors who had jumped ship, soldiers who had deserted, and a significant number of men from the multinational floating underworld that had been raiding Spanish shipping since the days of Drake. They came from England, from the Netherlands, from France, from the English colonies of Barbados and the Leeward Islands, from anywhere that men without prospects gathered and dreamed of sudden fortune. They were called buccaneers, and the word itself tells a story. It derived from the French bucanier, which referred to hunters on the island of Hispaniola who smoked meat over wooden frames called boucans. These hunters were themselves a mixed population, French, Dutch, English, African, and indigenous, who lived in the uncontrolled spaces of the Spanish Caribbean, surviving by killing wild cattle and pigs and selling the smoked meat to passing ships. When Spain attempted to eradicate them in the 1630s, killing the cattle, burning the boucans, driving the hunters from the land, many of them took to the sea. They had nothing left to lose. They knew the waters. They hated Spain. They became, depending on your perspective, either freedom fighters or pirates, and probably both. By the time Jamaica fell to the English, the buccaneers had been raiding Spanish shipping for 2 decades. They were organized, they were experienced, they had established bases on the island of Tortuga, off the northern coast of Hispaniola, and they operated under a rough democratic code that governed the division of plunder and the election of captains. What they lacked was a permanent, secure harbor controlled by a major European power willing to turn a blind eye. Port Royal gave them that harbor, and in exchange, they gave Port Royal everything it would become. The economics were simple. A buccaneer vessel would leave Port Royal with provisions, weapons, and a skeleton crew. It would sail to the Spanish Main, the coastline of what is now Venezuela, Colombia, Panama, and Central America, or into the waters around Cuba and Hispaniola. It would attack Spanish ships or Spanish towns or Spanish treasure fleets if it was lucky and brave. It would return to Port Royal with plunder, gold, silver, jewels, enslaved Africans stolen from Spanish slavers, cocoa, tobacco, indigo, hides, anything of value. The plunder would be divided according to the ship's articles, the captain and officers taking larger shares, the common sailors taking smaller ones, the wounded receiving additional compensation according to a fixed schedule of payments for lost limbs and eyes. And then the money would be spent. This is the part that made Port Royal rich. The privateers did not save their money. They could not have saved it if they tried. There was nowhere to invest it, no financial infrastructure, no securities or bonds or land speculation schemes. What there was, in abundance, was liquor and women and gambling and every other form of immediate gratification that could be provided by a population that had sprung up specifically to provide it. The taverns came first, then the brothels, then the goldsmiths who could convert Spanish pieces of 8 into English currency at favorable rates, then The merchants who sold provisions at inflated prices, and the coopers who made barrels, and the sailmakers who patched canvas, and the carpenters who repaired hulls, and the gunsmiths who serviced weapons, and the surgeons who removed limbs, and the preachers who buried the dead, and the prostitutes who buried the living for as long as the money held out. Port Royal became a service economy built entirely around the extraction and immediate consumption of Spanish wealth. The numbers are difficult to reconstruct with precision, but the shape is clear. In 1662, Port Royal had perhaps 740 residents. By 1680, it had somewhere between 60,000 and 10,000, comparable to Boston, larger than Charleston, one of the most significant English settlements in the Americas. The population density was extraordinary. The town covered approximately 53 acres, roughly the size of a medium shopping mall, and contained nearly 2,000 buildings crammed onto streets so narrow that two men could not walk abreast. The average lot was 25 feet by 60 feet. The buildings were 2 and 3 stories tall, brick at the bottom, wood above, their foundations sunk into sand that engineers today would classify as highly susceptible to liquefaction. The wealth was real, and it was visible. A census of Port Royal in 1680 recorded 213 goldsmiths, silversmiths, and jewelers, more per capita than any city in the English Empire. There were importers selling the finest goods from Europe: silk, lace, pewter, furniture, wine, books, clocks. There were craftsmen serving a clientele with money to burn and no interest in moderation. A visitor in the 1680s reported that a well-dressed prostitute in Port Royal might wear more jewelry than a duchess in London. This may have been exaggeration, but it was exaggeration rooted in observation. Port Royal was a city where the usual rules about who could wear what had been suspended by the simple fact of available cash. And underneath it all, silent in the records, was the other economy that made the visible one possible. Jamaica in 1692 contained perhaps 40,000 enslaved Africans. Port Royal contained perhaps 2,000 fowlers, roughly a quarter of the town's population. They unloaded the ships, they hauled the cargo, they served in the taverns and worked in the warehouses and cooked the food and emptied the chamber pots. They made the beds in the brothels and hauled water from the few wells and swept the streets and did, in short, the physical labor that allowed the visible economy to function. Their voices do not appear in the depositions that survive the earthquake. Their names, for the most part, are not recorded. When the earthquake struck, they died in the same collapsing buildings as their masters, but they were not commemorated in the memorials or the sermons. They were the foundation, and like all foundations, they were invisible to the people who stood on them. The slave trade was not incidental to Port Royal's economy. It was central. The Royal African Company, the English monopoly on the Atlantic slave trade, maintained a permanent factor in Port Royal to receive and sell human cargo. Private slavers, illegally but with the tacit cooperation of colonial authorities, brought additional shipments. The buccaneers themselves frequently captured enslaved people from Spanish ships and Spanish plantations and brought them to Port Royal for sale. The wealth that flowed through the taverns and the brothels and the goldsmiths' shops was, ultimately, wealth extracted from both Spanish colonial enterprise and African bodies. The two extractions were intertwined. They could not be separated then, and they cannot be separated now. This is the Port Royal that existed on the morning of June 7th, 1692. 40 years of accumulation, 40 years of profit, 40 years of building on sand, literal sand, sand that had been deposited by Caribbean currents and compacted by the weight of brick and timber until it resembled solid ground, but which was not solid ground, which was not even close. The earthquake that struck at 1143 was not, by later seismic standards, extraordinary. Modern geologists estimate its magnitude at 7.5, powerful but not unprecedented for the region. The Caribbean sits atop a complex system of tectonic plates, and Jamaica in particular straddles a transform boundary where the Gonaïves microplate slides against the Caribbean plate. Earthquakes had struck the island before. Small tremors were common enough that residents had learned to ignore them. What they had not experienced, what no living English person in the Americas had experienced, was a major seismic event striking directly beneath a dense urban settlement built on unconsolidated marine sediment. The technical term is liquefaction. When saturated sand is subjected to seismic shaking, it loses its structural integrity. The grains, normally held in place by friction and gravity, begin to behave like a liquid. Buildings sink, the ground heaves, water erupts from fissures as the pressure of the shaking forces it up through channels it has carved in the suddenly mobile substrate. What had been solid becomes fluid, and everything built on the assumption of solidity collapses. This is what happened to Port Royal. The first shock came at 11:43 and lasted approximately 1 minute. Witnesses described the ground rolling in waves like the sea. Buildings began to tilt. The brick foundations, stronger than the sand beneath them, acted as rigid weights pushing downward into substrate that could no longer support them. Two-story structures became one-story structures, their lower floors sinking into the earth as if the ground were swallowing them. Three-story structures became two-story structures and then rubble. The narrow streets, already claustrophobic, became death traps as walls fell inward and roofs collapsed. Emmanuel Heath, the rector of St. Paul's, was finishing prayers when the shaking began. He would later write, "I could hardly keep on my knees, but was thrown this way and that way as a ship in a storm." He made for the door and emerged into a world transformed. The street outside the church was cracking open, water was rising through the fissures, buildings on either side were tilting at impossible angles, and the ground itself, Heath reported this with evident disbelief, was opening and closing like waves of the sea. People fell into the cracks. This is not metaphor. Dozens, possibly hundreds, of Port Royal residents were swallowed by the earth itself as fissures opened and closed during the shaking. Some were crushed. Some were buried alive with only their heads above ground. Some were caught in cracks that closed around their bodies at the waist, trapping them half in and half out, while the liquefied sand set around them like concrete. Louis Galdi, the French merchant counting Spanish coins that morning, was swallowed entirely. He fell through a fissure into what he believed was his grave, and then ejected by a subsequent shock, thrown back to the surface in a spray of water and sand, bruised but alive. He was the lucky one. The second shock came within minutes of the first, and it was this shock that destroyed what the first had damaged. The entire northern section of the town, the densest, wealthiest section, the section nearest the harbor, slid into the sea. It did not sink slowly. It went all at once, the sand beneath it liquefying completely, the buildings toppling forward and sideways and down as the ground that held them ceased to exist. 2,000 people were in that section of town when it went. Within the space of perhaps 2 minutes, the sea rushed in to fill the void they left behind. The survivors described the water as coming from everywhere at once, not just from the harbor, but from the ground itself, erupting through fissures, mixing with the liquefied sand, creating a slurry that was neither solid nor liquid, but something in between. People drowned standing up. They drowned in streets they had walked 1,000 times. They drowned reaching for walls that were no longer there. The wharf where John White had been tallying damaged goods, the careful merchant with his careful ledger, vanished entire, taking White and his records and his 93 barrels of molasses into 20 feet of water that had not existed 3 minutes before. The entire process, from the first tremor to the submersion of 2/3 of the city, took less than 3 minutes. The survivors stood on what remained, watching the Caribbean settle over the rooftops of houses they had lived in that morning. Some accounts described the dead floating to the surface. Others described the dogs of Port Royal, the survivors among them, swimming among the debris, howling. The bells of St. Paul's Church, which had not been rung for morning prayer, rang now without human hands as the tower swayed and settled, the mechanical result of a building shuddering its way to collapse. What was gone was gone. The principal streets of commerce, the majority of the warehouses, most of the taverns and brothels and goldsmiths' shops, the wharf and the docks and the harbor facilities, the private fortunes of 100 merchants sunk to the bottom of Kingston Harbor in locked strongboxes that would not be opened for 300 years. The lives of somewhere between 2,000 and 5,000 people, depending on whose count you accept, a number that would grow in the following weeks as disease swept through the refugee population and the dead went unburied in the Caribbean heat. And gone, too, though no one understood it yet, was Port Royal itself. Not the physical location. A rump of the town survived and would continue to exist for decades, but the thing Port Royal had been, the ungoverned space, the pirate haven, the wicked city, that was over. The earthquake did not just kill people and destroy property. It destroyed a way of life. It ended an era. It took the most lawless city in the Western world and dropped it into the sea like a judgment. The preachers who preached after, and there were many, saw exactly this. "The Lord hath made bare his holy arm in the eyes of all the nations," wrote one minister, "and all the ends of the earth have seen the salvation of our God." Port Royal had been a city of sin, and the Lord had unmade it. QED. The logic was irresistible. The city had been wicked, and the city had been destroyed. What further proof was needed? But the preacher's explanation, satisfying as it was, raised a question they could not answer. Why had Port Royal been there in the first place? If God objected to wickedness, why had he permitted 40 years of it? Why had the earthquake spared the city in the 1660s when the wickedness was at its height, and Henry Morgan, the greatest of the buccaneers, was sacking Portobello and burning Panama? Why had the judgment waited until 1692, by which time the golden age was already fading, the buccaneers already scattering, the pirate economy already transforming into something more respectable and less profitable? The answer the preachers gave was that God worked in his own time. The answer we might give is different. Port Royal existed because it was useful. It ceased to exist when the ground it stood on stopped being solid. The relationship between those two facts, usefulness and solidity, is the real subject of this story. Because Port Royal was not just a city. It was an experiment. An experiment in what happens when you build wealth without foundation, when you make power without law, when you extract without replacing. The experiment ran for 40 years. The results are still underwater. To understand why Port Royal existed, why England permitted it, why Spain could not destroy it, why it became for 4 decades the richest and most dangerous city in the Americas, we must first understand the Caribbean itself. Not the Caribbean of cruise ships and resort beaches, but the Caribbean of the 17th century. A killing ground, a frontier, a space so contested and so violent that the normal rules of European civilization simply did not apply. The Caribbean Sea in 1655, the year England seized Jamaica from Spain, was not a single thing. It was a collection of islands scattered across 1,000 miles of water, each island a separate world, each colonial power maintaining footholds where it could and abandoning what it could not hold. Spain claimed everything, had claimed everything since Columbus, but Spain could not police what it claimed. The distances were too vast, the islands too numerous, the coastlines too irregular, too riddled with hidden bays and uncharted channels. A ship leaving Seville might take 8 weeks to reach the Caribbean. A ship leaving Cartagena might take 3 weeks to reach Havana. In between those points lay an ocean that belonged to no one and everyone, where the flag you flew mattered less than the guns you carried and the speed of your hull. The treasure fleet sailed through this water. That was the heart of everything. Every year, or as close to every year as weather and war permitted, Spanish galleons gathered the accumulated wealth of a continent and carried it across the Atlantic to Seville. Silver from the mines of Potosi, gold from New Granada, emeralds from Colombia, pearls from the Venezuelan coast, indigo, cochineal, hides, tobacco, cacao. The combined output of an empire that stretched from California to Tierra del Fuego, all of it funneled through a handful of Caribbean ports, Veracruz, Cartagena, Portobello, Havana, and then across 3,000 miles of open water to the counting houses of Spain. The value of these shipments defies easy comprehension. A single treasure fleet might carry the equivalent of 100 million modern dollars. Over the course of the 16th and 17th centuries, Spain extracted from the Americas something like 181 tons of gold and 16,000 tons of silver, enough metal to reshape the entire European economy, to fund wars, to build cathedrals, to inflate prices across a continent. And every ounce of it, at some point in its journey, passed through the Caribbean Sea. England wanted that wealth. France wanted that wealth. The Netherlands wanted that wealth. And since Spain was not inclined to share, they would have to take it. But how? The Caribbean was Spain's sea. Spanish ships had sailed it for a century and a half before the English established their first permanent settlement in the Americas. Spanish ports dotted the coastlines. Spanish forts guarded the harbors. The treasure fleet sailed under the protection of heavily armed warships, their routes known, their schedules roughly predictable, but their precise movements guarded like state secrets. A single nation challenging Spain directly, fleet against fleet, army against army, would face the full weight of the world's largest empire. The costs would be ruinous, the outcome uncertain. So England, France, and the Netherlands found another way. They privatized the war. This is where the buccaneers come from, not from some romantic impulse toward freedom or rebellion, but from a cold strategic calculation made in the capitals of Europe. If you cannot afford a navy large enough to challenge Spain, you commission private citizens to do it for you. You give them letters of marque, legal documents authorizing them to attack enemy shipping, and you take a percentage of whatever they capture. You provide them with ports where they can sell their plunder, courts where their captures can be declared legitimate prizes, and a legal framework that transforms piracy into privateering. The distinction matters. A pirate is a criminal who can be hanged by any nation that captures him. A privateer is a soldier of sorts, protected by the laws of war. The distinction was often theoretical. Spain certainly hanged any English privateer it caught regardless of his papers, but it mattered in English ports, where the difference between a death sentence and a hero's welcome might depend on whether your commission was properly signed. Jamaica was seized in 1655 specifically to create a base for this strategy. The English expedition that took the island was not primarily a settlement venture. It was a military operation, part of Oliver Cromwell's Western design, an ambitious attempt to establish English dominance in the Caribbean by capturing Spain's most valuable possessions. The original targets were Hispaniola and Cuba. The expedition failed at both. The English fleet, poorly supplied and badly coordinated, arrived at Hispaniola in April 1655 with something like 8,000 soldiers, most of them sick, many of them already dying of diseases they had contracted on the voyage out. They landed. They marched inland. They found no treasure, no food, and Spanish defenders who, though vastly outnumbered, knew the terrain and fought with the desperation of men defending their homes. The English retreated in disorder. The commanding officers blamed each other. The army had lost perhaps 1,000 men to combat, disease, and desertion before it ever came within sight of Santo Domingo's walls. Jamaica was the consolation prize. The fleet sailed south, looking for something, anything they could capture to justify the expense of the expedition. Jamaica was lightly defended. It fell in a week. The Spanish colonists, numbering perhaps 1,500, fled to the mountains, then to Cuba. The English had their island. But what did they have exactly? Jamaica in 1655 was not a prize. It was a liability. The island had no treasure. It had no developed sugar plantations. It had no significant port facilities. What it had was a harbor, a natural harbor of extraordinary quality on the southeastern coast, protected by a long, narrow peninsula of sand that curled around the entrance like a protective arm. The Spaniards had built a small settlement at the end of this peninsula, a fishing village called Cayo de Carena. The English renamed it Port Royal, and they began, almost immediately, to make it into something else. The strategic logic was simple. Jamaica sat at the center of the Caribbean Sea like a spider in its web. From Port Royal, a ship could reach Hispaniola in 2 days. It could reach Cuba in 3. It could reach the Spanish Main, the northern coast of South America, in a week. It could intercept treasure fleets bound for Havana. It could raid the ports where the treasure was gathered. It could strike and disappear before Spanish warships could respond. And when the striking was done, It could return to Port Royal to sell its plunder, repair its ships, and drink away its profits before sailing out again. The English governors of Jamaica understood this immediately. They had been given an island with no economy and no population. The original expedition force was dying at the rate of 100 men a week from tropical diseases, and reinforcements were slow to arrive. They could not defend the island conventionally. They did not have the men, the money, or the fortifications. But they could make Jamaica so valuable to privateers that the privateers would defend it for them. Governor Edward de Oily, who administered Jamaica from 1657 to 1661, issued the first commissions. He offered English and French sea captains a simple deal. Attack Spanish shipping, bring your prizes to Port Royal, and we will give you legal protection, a place to sell your goods, and a market for your needs. The response was immediate. Within 2 years, Port Royal was hosting a rotating population of several hundred privateers. Within 5 years, it was the busiest port in the English Caribbean. The men who came were not in the main from the respectable classes. They were escaped indentured servants from Barbados, where the sugar plantations worked men to death, and the only escape was the sea. They were survivors of failed expeditions, stranded in the Caribbean with no way home. They were French Huguenots fleeing religious persecution, Dutch sailors displaced by war, Irish transportees sold into bondage after Cromwell's conquest. They were men with nothing to lose and nowhere else to go, and they were offered in Port Royal something that did not exist anywhere else in the 17th century world, a meritocracy of violence. On a buccaneer ship, the captain was elected. The crew voted on major decisions. Plunder was divided according to strict formulas. The captain received a larger share than the common sailor, but not vastly larger, and the formulas were known in advance. A man injured in battle received compensation, 600 pieces of 8 for the loss of a right arm, 500 for the left, 100 for an eye. These were formal agreements, drawn up before each voyage and signed, or, for the illiterate majority, marked, by every member of the crew. The buccaneers called them articles. Historians would later recognize them as something close to constitutions. This was not democracy in any modern sense. The captains were often brutal, the discipline harsh, the violence constant. But compared to the world these men had fled, the world of indentured servitude and naval impressment, of flogging and keel-hauling and absolute obedience to officers who had purchased their commissions rather than earned them, the buccaneer ships offered something almost like freedom. You could rise, you could profit, you could vote out a captain who displeased you, though the process often involved more blood than ballots. And if you survived long enough to retire, and very few did, you could walk away rich. Port Royal was where this system touched land. It was where the plunder was spent, where the crews recruited, where the ships were refitted, where the business of violence was conducted. And it was organized, to the extent it was organized at all, around the principle of maximum extraction with minimum governance. The town's physical structure reflected this. There were no city walls. There was no formal planning. Buildings went up where there was space, in whatever style their owners could afford, crowding together along streets that followed the logic of foot traffic rather than any municipal vision. The main thoroughfare was High Street, which ran the length of the peninsula, but calling it a thoroughfare implies a grandeur it did not possess. It was a strip of hard-packed sand, sometimes muddy, usually reeking, lined with warehouses and taverns and the occasional church. Side streets branched off at irregular intervals, leading to wharves, to more taverns, to the brothels that clustered near the water, to the goldsmiths' shops where the products of plunder were converted into portable wealth. At its peak, Port Royal contained something like 2,000 buildings crowded onto 50 acres of sand. The population fluctuated wildly, perhaps 5,000 permanent residents, with another 2,000 to 3,000 transients at any given time depending on how many ships were in port. This density would have been notable in London, in the Caribbean, where most settlements were scattered plantations or small fishing villages. It was unprecedented. Port Royal was the second largest English city in the Americas. Only Boston was larger. And Boston, whatever its virtues, did not have Port Royal's money. The wealth was real. This is important to understand, because the mythologizing that followed, The stories of treasure and debauchery, of fortunes won and lost in a single night, can make Port Royal seem like a fantasy, a pirate legend inflated beyond all proportion to reality. But the records that survive, the court proceedings and shipping manifests and diplomatic correspondence, confirm that Port Royal was genuinely, almost incomprehensibly wealthy. When a single expedition could return with plunder worth the annual budget of a small European nation, and Morgan's sack of Panama in 1671 yielded something like 300,000 pounds, the equivalent of perhaps 40 million modern dollars, the spending that followed was not legend. It was arithmetic. The merchants who served this economy became rich, fabulously, scandalously rich, richer than sugar planters, richer than slave traders, richer in some cases than the merchants of London itself. They built houses of brick and stone in a town where most structures were wood and thatch. They filled those houses with goods imported from Europe, furniture, porcelain, silverware, paintings, displaying the trappings of civilization in a place where civilization's rules did not apply. They married daughters of English gentry and sent their sons to be educated in London. They accumulated silver plate measured in hundreds of pounds weight, and they died, like everyone else in Port Royal, within a few years of arrival, because the tropics did not care how much money you had. The mortality rate was staggering. Recent scholarship suggests that something like 80% of English settlers who came to Jamaica in the 1660s were dead within 5 years. Malaria and yellow fever were endemic. Dysentery was constant. The water supply was contaminated by the same latrines that served the drinking wells. Alcohol consumption, which was universal, partly because beer and rum were safer than water, weakened immune systems already under assault from unfamiliar diseases. A man who arrived in Port Royal at 20 might, if lucky, live to 35. More likely, he would be dead by 30. This created a particular psychology. Why save when you might be dead tomorrow? Why invest in the future when the future was measured in months rather than decades? Why moderate your pleasures when moderation would not save you and excess might at least be enjoyed while you lasted? The famous debauchery of Port Royal. The taverns open at all hours, the prostitutes numbering, according to some accounts, 1 for every 10 inhabitants, the gambling and drinking and fighting that filled the streets whenever a prize ship came in, was not just the expression of criminal license. It was a rational response to a situation where long-term planning made no sense. The governor of Jamaica, whoever held the post at any given moment, was caught in an impossible position. His commission came from England, where the policies of the crown shifted constantly depending on whether England was at war with Spain, at peace with Spain, or in the liminal space between. During wartime, the privateers were heroes, protecting English interests and enriching English coffers. During peacetime, they were an embarrassment, threatening delicate diplomatic negotiations and provoking Spanish retaliation. The governor was expected to control them, to ensure that their commissions were properly issued and their prizes properly adjudicated, but he had no real means of enforcement. The privateers outnumbered his garrison. The privateers controlled the economy. The privateers were the only effective defense Jamaica had against Spanish invasion. If the governor pushed too hard, they would simply sail to Tortuga or Curaçao or some other port where the authorities were less troublesome. And then Jamaica would have neither their protection nor their money. So the governors accommodated. They issued commissions generously, looked the other way when the terms were exceeded, and took their percentages of the plunder like everyone else. They built fortifications, Fort Charles at the end of the peninsula, Fort James and Fort Carlisle at strategic points around the harbor, but they built them with money from prize courts and customs duties, which is to say with money that existed only because the privateers existed. The defenses of Jamaica were funded by the very activity those defenses were ostensibly designed to regulate. Henry Morgan understood this system better than anyone, and he rose to the top of it by understanding that violence, properly organized, could produce not just wealth, but legitimacy. He arrived in Jamaica sometime in the late 1650s. The exact date is unclear. As a young soldier or sailor, one of the thousands of anonymous Englishmen washing around the Caribbean in the aftermath of the Western Design's failure. Within a decade, he was the most successful buccaneer in the Caribbean. Within 2 decades, he would be Lieutenant Governor of Jamaica, knighted by the King of England and the official enforcer of the very laws he had spent his career breaking. Morgan's early career follows the typical pattern of Caribbean advancement: small raids, then larger ones, then command of his own vessel, then command of multiple vessels, then command of entire fleets. By 1668, when he led the assault on Portobello, he had assembled something like 500 men and 12 ships. Not a navy, but something close to it. Portobello was one of the most important ports on the Spanish Main, the terminus where Peruvian silver was transferred from the Pacific Coast mule trains to the Atlantic galleons. It was defended by 3 forts and a garrison of several hundred soldiers. Morgan took it in less than 24 hours. The methods were efficient and ruthless. Morgan landed his men at night, miles from the town, and marched overland through the jungle to avoid the harbor defenses. His buccaneers stormed the first fort before dawn, overwhelming the sentries before an alarm could be raised. The second fort fell within hours. The third, the main citadel, held out longer. Its Spanish commander mounted a creditable defense, but Morgan had prisoners, and he was willing to use them. The accounts differ on the details, but the thrust is consistent. Morgan forced captured civilians, including women and clergy, to carry scaling ladders to the walls, ensuring that the Spanish defenders could not fire without killing their own people. The citadel fell. The governor was captured. The town was sacked. The plunder from Portobello was extraordinary. Morgan extracted ransom from the governor, tribute from the citizens, and the accumulated wealth of the warehouses: silver bars, coins, plate, jewelry, goods awaiting shipment to Spain. When he sailed back to Port Royal 2 months later, his fleet carried something like 250,000 pieces of 8, a sum that represented perhaps a year's income for a mid-sized European city. The division, following the articles agreed before the voyage, gave each common sailor a share worth more than a decade's wages for a working man in England. The captains and officers received correspondingly more. Morgan himself received the captain's share, plus the admiral's share, plus whatever additional percentages the articles had specified. He came home rich, but more importantly, he came home legitimate. The raid on Portobello had been conducted under a commission from Governor Modiford, who had authorized Morgan to draw together the English privateers and attack the Spanish. The fact that England and Spain were technically at peace, had been at peace since 1660, was handled with the convenient fiction that the Spanish had been planning an attack on Jamaica, and Morgan's raid was a preemptive defensive measure. The prize court in Port Royal duly declared the plunder legitimate. The customs duties were paid, the merchants bought the goods, the economy boomed, and Henry Morgan, who had just committed what by any honest accounting was an act of piracy against a nation with which England was not at war, was celebrated as a hero. This was the Port Royal system in its purest form. Violence was laundered through paperwork. Crime was transmuted into commerce. The unthinkable became, through the proper forms and procedures, respectable. And the machine, fed by plunder and oiled by corruption, continued to run. 2 years later, Morgan exceeded Portobello with Panama. The Isthmus city was the linchpin of Spain's Pacific trade, the point where South American silver crossed the continent on its way to Europe. It was larger than Portobello, more heavily defended, and deeper in Spanish territory. To reach it, Morgan would have to cross the entire width of Panama, traversing jungle, river, and mountain. The Spanish would have weeks of warning. The logistics were impossible. Morgan did it anyway. In January 1671, he led over 1,000 men, the largest buccaneer army ever assembled, up the Chagres River and across the Continental Divide. The 9-day march nearly destroyed them. The jungle provided no food. The Spanish had cleared the route of provisions. Men died of starvation, of disease, of exhaustion. They ate leather. They ate grass. They ate, according to some accounts, their own dead. But they kept moving because Morgan kept them moving. And on January 28th, they emerged from the jungle onto the Pacific slope and saw Panama City spread below them. The battle lasted less than a morning. The Spanish governor had assembled a force of perhaps 2,000 men, including cavalry. But the charge the cavalry attempted broke against the buccaneer line. The Spanish infantry, many of them militia rather than regular soldiers, fled after the cavalry failed. The buccaneers entered the city that afternoon. They found the treasury empty. The Spanish had loaded the most valuable goods onto ships and fled to Ecuador, but they found enough: silver, gold, merchandise, and hostages worth ransoming. When Morgan sailed home, he carried the largest prize in Caribbean history. The sack of Panama caused an international incident. Spain protested. England, under pressure to maintain the peace, arrested Morgan and shipped him to London to stand trial. He never stood trial. The journey took months. By the time he arrived, the political winds had shifted. War with Spain seemed possible again. Morgan, the embarrassment, became Morgan the asset. The king knighted him. The government shipped him back to Jamaica as lieutenant governor. He was 39 years old. For the next decade, Henry Morgan, the buccaneer, the pirate admiral, the man who had sacked Portobello and burned Panama, was one of the officials responsible for suppressing piracy in Jamaica. The irony was not lost on anyone, but Morgan took the job seriously, or at least seriously enough. He prosecuted pirates, he hanged former colleagues, he enforced the very laws he had spent his career evading, and he got rich in new ways: land speculation, sugar planting, the respectable wealth that replaced the violent kind as Port Royal transformed from pirate haven to colonial port. He died in 1688, 4 years before the earthquake. Drink had ruined him. His body was swollen, his liver failing, his energy gone. He was 53 years old, which was elderly for a man who had lived as he had lived. He was buried in Port Royal Cemetery, in the consecrated ground he had earned through his later respectability. When the earthquake came, his grave, like most of Port Royal, went into the sea. His body has never been found. But before he died, before the earthquake, before the earth opened and the city sank, Morgan had witnessed something he may not have fully understood: the end of the era he represented. The buccaneers were scattering, the great raids were over. The privateering commissions that had once been issued freely were now restricted, withheld, subjected to scrutiny that would have been unthinkable in the 1660s. Port Royal was still wealthy, but its wealth was changing character. Less plunder, more trade, less violence, more commerce. The pirate haven was becoming, slowly and unevenly, a legitimate port. The reasons were partly diplomatic. England's relationship with Spain had stabilized, and partly demographic. The Caribbean was filling up. The empty spaces where buccaneers had hidden and raided were being claimed, settled, fortified. The sugar economy was booming, and sugar planters wanted order, not adventure. They wanted ships that arrived on schedule with slaves and supplies, not ships that might or might not return from some raid on the Spanish Main. They wanted a navy that patrolled, not privateers who plundered. They wanted, in short, civilization, or at least their version of it. Port Royal in 1692, on the morning the earthquake struck, was caught between these two worlds. The old Port Royal was fading, but not yet gone. The taverns still operated, the brothels still served, the merchants still dealt in goods that could not bear close examination. But the new Port Royal was emerging. Churches built with pirate money, courts that functioned with increasing regularity, a society that aspired to respectability even as it could not quite forget how its wealth had been acquired. The earthquake destroyed both. It took the wicked city and the would-be respectable city and dropped them into the same harbor, indifferent to the distinction. What rose from the rubble was something else entirely. The morning of June 7, 1692 began like any other in Port Royal. The sun rose hot and heavy over the harbor, burning off the thin mist that had settled on the water during the night. Ships at anchor, perhaps 40 of them, merchantmen and naval vessels and the smaller craft that serviced the port, swayed gently in a harbor that had seen little wind for days. The air was thick, humid, the kind of Caribbean summer air that pressed against the skin and made even simple movements feel laborious. In the streets, such as they were, the morning business had begun. Merchants opened their counting houses, slaves carried water and goods through the narrow passages between buildings. In the taverns that had operated through the night, the last of the drinkers were being shown the door or had simply passed out where they sat. The brothels were quiet in the morning hours, their occupants sleeping off the previous evening's commerce. Somewhere, church bells were ringing. Port Royal had churches now, proper Anglican churches with proper bells, markers of the respectability the city was still learning to wear. Dr. Emmanuel Heath, rector of St. Paul's Church, was preparing to take his midday meal with John White, the acting governor. Heath was a clergyman, educated, observant, the kind of man who kept detailed records of what he saw. He would later write one of the most important first-hand accounts of what was about to happen. At 11:43 in the morning, the time would become one of the few fixed points in the catastrophe, Heath felt the ground move beneath his feet. He described the sensation later, a rolling, swaying motion like standing on the deck of a ship in a gentle swell. Except this was land. Land did not move. Land was, by definition, the thing that stayed still while everything else shifted around it. For a moment, Heath must have thought he was mistaken, dizzy, ill. Then, the second wave hit. The earthquake that destroyed Port Royal was not, by the standards of major seismic events, a singular shock. It came in 3 distinct waves, each stronger than the last, each building on the destruction the previous wave had begun. The first tremor was a warning most people did not understand how to read. The second was unmistakable. The third was apocalyptic. To understand what happened in the next 2 minutes, and it was less than 2 minutes, the entire destruction of the most prosperous city in the English Americas compressed into a span shorter than it takes to walk from one end of a modern city block to the other. You have to understand what Port Royal was built on and how it was built. The city sat on a narrow sand spit, a quay extending into Kingston Harbor, like a crooked finger pointing toward the open sea. This geographic accident was what made Port Royal such an excellent harbor in the first place. The spit created a natural breakwater, a protected anchorage where ships could ride at anchor without fear of sudden storms or heavy swells. The water was deep enough for large vessels to approach close to shore, making loading and unloading faster and easier than at most Caribbean ports. From a nautical perspective, the site was nearly perfect. From a geological perspective, it was a disaster waiting to happen. The spit was not rock. It was not even the compressed coral limestone that formed the foundation of much of Jamaica. It was sand, loose, unconsolidated sand, the accumulated sediment of centuries of tidal action and storm deposition, held together by nothing more than gravity and the absence of anything to disturb it. The sand was saturated with water. Below a few feet of relatively stable surface, the substrate was essentially a slurry, solid enough to support buildings in normal conditions, but fundamentally unstable when subjected to the right kind of stress. The right kind of stress was exactly what arrived on the morning of June 7th. The earthquake originated along a fault system that runs beneath Jamaica, part of the complex tectonic boundary between the Caribbean and North American plates. Modern seismologists estimate the quake's magnitude at somewhere between 7.5 and 8.0, a major event by any standard, comparable to the earthquakes that have leveled cities throughout history. But the magnitude alone does not explain what happened to Port Royal. Earthquakes of similar or greater strength have struck cities built on solid bedrock without producing anything like the devastation that followed. What destroyed Port Royal was not just the earthquake. It was what the earthquake did to the sand. The phenomenon is called liquefaction. When loose, water-saturated sediment is subjected to intense vibration, the kind of vibration produced by a major earthquake, the individual grains of sand lose contact with each other. The water between them, normally held in place by capillary action and the pressure of the material above, becomes free to move. The solid ground transforms in an instant into something that behaves more like a liquid than a solid. Heavy objects sink. Light objects rise. Anything built on the liquefied substrate loses its foundation entirely. Port Royal was built on sand that was waiting to liquefy, and Port Royal was built heavy. This was one of the ironies that the city's residents could not have understood. The very wealth they had accumulated, the brick buildings, the stone warehouses, the substantial houses with their thick walls and tile roofs, all the permanent construction that marked Port Royal as a city of consequence rather than a collection of temporary shacks, became instruments of their destruction. A lighter city might have survived. Wooden structures, even substantial ones, might have ridden out the liquefaction, settling and tilting but remaining essentially intact. The heavy buildings sank like ships. The brick and stone drove downward through the suddenly liquid sand, dragging their occupants with them. The sequence of destruction unfolded over less than 2 minutes, but within that interval, distinct phases can be identified from survivor accounts. The first seconds were confusion. The ground was moving, rolling, swaying in ways that contradicted every certainty about the nature of solid earth. People stumbled, reached for walls, tried to understand what was happening. Some ran into the streets, a reflexive escape from the buildings that suddenly felt unsafe. Others froze, caught between motion and incomprehension. The human mind requires time to process events that violate fundamental assumptions about reality. For many residents of Port Royal, that processing time was exactly the time they did not have. Then the ground opened. The fissures appeared without warning, cracks in the earth that spread through the streets and through the floors of buildings, some narrow enough to step across, others wide enough to swallow a man whole. The sand beneath the cracks was already liquefying, already beginning its transformation into a substrate that could not support weight. People fell into these cracks. The accounts are consistent on this point across multiple survivors, men and women and children visible one moment, gone the next, the earth closing over them as the liquefied sand flowed back to fill the spaces that had opened. Some were swallowed to the waist and then crushed as the fissures closed. Some went in head first. Some managed to pull themselves out before the closure came. Others did not. Dr. Heath, watching from his vantage point, later wrote that he saw people swallowed up as were the rebels who opposed Moses. The biblical comparison was automatic for a clergyman of his era, but the observation beneath it was precise. The earth was literally consuming the population. This was not metaphor. This was mechanical fact. The buildings began to sink. The heavy structures, the counting houses, the warehouses, the substantial homes of the wealthy merchants dropped through the liquefied sand as though the ground beneath them had simply ceased to exist. Some went straight down, their walls remaining vertical as they descended, the rooflines dropping from second-story height to ground level to below ground level, disappearing entirely in a matter of seconds. Others tilted as they sank, one side going down faster than the other, the buildings rotating as they descended until they lay nearly horizontal, their inhabitants trapped inside as sand and water flowed in to fill every opening. The streets themselves were sinking. The elevation of the sand spit, never more than a few feet above sea level at its highest points, was dropping. Water was rising, the harbor was advancing. What had been dry land was becoming, in real time, part of the ocean floor. And then the harbor itself became a weapon. Accounts differ on whether what struck Port Royal should be called a tsunami in the modern technical sense. The wave that swept over the city may have been a seismic sea wave generated by the underwater displacement of the earthquake, or it may have been the harbor water rushing in to fill the spaces created by the sudden subsidence of the land, or it may have been some combination of both. The distinction would have been meaningless to anyone standing in its path. What mattered was that a wall of water, estimates suggest it was between 6 and 8 feet high, possibly higher in places, crashed over the remains of the city, sweeping away everything and everyone that the earthquake had not already buried. The wave arrived approximately 90 seconds after the first tremor. For anyone who had survived the initial shocks, who had escaped the fissures, who had pulled themselves from collapsing buildings, who had managed to remain on the surface of the liquefying sand, the wave was the final judgment. It dragged bodies out to sea. It collapsed structures that had remained standing. It filled the fissures that had opened in the ground, turning buried survivors into drowned ones. The entire sequence, from the first tremor to the recession of the wave, took less than 2 minutes. Some accounts say 3. None say more than that. In the time it takes to read this account of the earthquake itself had finished its work. What remained of Port Royal when the shaking stopped was not a city. It was a debris field extending from the remnants of the sand spit out into Kingston Harbor, a scatter of broken timber and shattered masonry, of bodies floating and bodies buried, of ships torn from their moorings and thrown onto what had been dry land, of dry land that was now underwater, of underwater areas that had risen to become islands of churned sand and broken brick. The numbers are impossible to know with precision, and the sources disagree. But the consensus of historical estimates suggests that approximately 2,000 people died in the earthquake itself, in the fissures, in the collapsing buildings, in the wave, in the immediate aftermath of injuries from which there was no recovery. This figure does not include the deaths from disease and injury in the weeks that followed, which may have doubled the toll. Port Royal's pre-earthquake population was somewhere between 6,000 and 7,000, possibly higher. If these estimates are correct, the earthquake killed roughly 1 in 3 of the city's residents in under 2 minutes. Another 2,000, perhaps more, died in the subsequent epidemic. The bodies that could not be recovered, and most bodies could not be recovered, the city having sunk beneath the harbor, began to decompose in the warm Caribbean water. The survivors, crowded together without adequate shelter, without clean water, without food supplies that had not been contaminated, began to sicken almost immediately. Dysentery, typhoid, diseases that thrived wherever sanitation collapsed and populations were stressed, these claimed lives for weeks after the earthquake itself had ended. The physical geography of Port Royal was transformed beyond recognition. Before the earthquake, the sand spit had been approximately 51 acres of dry, usable land. Crowded, certainly, perhaps the most densely populated area in the English Americas, but land, nonetheless, solid enough to build on and live on and conduct business on. After the earthquake, approximately 33 of those acres were underwater. 2/3 of the city had simply ceased to exist as dry land. What remained was a fragment, a remnant, a narrow strip of sand that could never again support the kind of dense urban development that had made Port Royal what it was. The survivors faced immediate and impossible choices. Some fled to Spanish Town, the official capital of Jamaica that had always resented Port Royal's wealth and swagger. Some fled to the north side of the harbor, to the area that would eventually become Kingston. Some remained on the remnant of the spit, salvaging what could be salvaged, burying what dead could be reached, trying to understand what had happened and what would happen next. The salvage operations began almost immediately, conducted by the desperate and the opportunistic in roughly equal measure. The harbor floor where Port Royal had stood was not deep, perhaps 20 to 30 feet in most places, shallow enough that in clear water you could see the rooflines of the sunken buildings beneath the surface. Divers went down within days of the disaster, searching for whatever could be recovered. Some were looking for survivors, though by the time diving was possible, there were no survivors to find. Some were looking for bodies, though the bodies that had not floated to the surface were mostly beyond recovery. Most were looking for valuables, the coins, the plate, the merchandise that had filled the warehouses and counting houses before they sank. Some of these early salvagers were relatives of the dead, trying to recover inheritances. Some were the dead themselves, in a sense, merchants whose wealth had gone underwater and who were trying to resurrect their fortunes before someone else claimed them. Some were simple looters, opportunists who saw in the catastrophe a final chance at the kind of sudden wealth that Port Royal had always promised. The distinction between legitimate salvage and theft was impossible to enforce in the chaos of the aftermath. The line between the two had never been particularly clear in Port Royal anyway. The ships in the harbor presented their own strange testament to the disaster. Some had been torn from their moorings and thrown onto the land, or onto what had been the land before it sank. Others had been carried over areas that had been streets and buildings, and dropped, when the wave receded, onto the rooftops of submerged structures. The HMS Swan, a frigate of the Royal Navy, was carried over the remains of the city and deposited in a position so improbable that early accounts were not believed until the wreck was surveyed. The Swan came to rest on top of a building, or rather on top of where a building had stood before it sank. The ship's hull wedged between what had been upper stories, its masts protruding from the water at angles that made no sense until you understood that you were looking at a ship resting on a house, resting on the floor of a newly created harbor. The Swan became one of the strangest rescue stories of the disaster. The ship, though badly damaged and grounded in an impossible position, remained intact enough that survivors were able to climb onto its hull and wait for rescue. Others swam to it through the debris-choked water, clinging to its sides until boats could reach them. The frigate saved perhaps 200 lives. a ship that had been lifted from the water and deposited on land, saving the people who had been lifted from the land and deposited in the water. Within weeks, the colonial government had to make decisions about Port Royal's future. Some argued for abandonment. The spit was clearly unstable. The harbor floor had proven itself untrustworthy. The survivors had already begun scattering to other locations. Better to build fresh somewhere safe, somewhere that did not carry the memory and the risk of what had just happened. Others argued for rebuilding. The harbor was still excellent, perhaps the best in the Caribbean for commercial purposes. The infrastructure was gone, but infrastructure could be replaced. The reputation was damaged, but reputations could be rebuilt. Port Royal's advantages, its location, its depth, its protection from weather, remained intact even if everything built on that location had been destroyed. The debate was ultimately resolved by a force more powerful than any government decision: economics. The merchants who had survived needed somewhere to conduct business immediately, not in the years it would take to build a new city from scratch. The Royal Navy needed a Caribbean base. The remnant of Port Royal, small as it was, still existed. Rebuilding began within months of the disaster, wooden structures going up on the narrow strip of sand that remained above water, a smaller and more cautious version of the city that had been. But the rebuilt Port Royal was never again what it had been. The density was gone, not just because the land area was smaller, but because no one wanted to replicate the conditions that had made the destruction so complete. The population was gone, scattered to Spanish Town, to the new settlement at Kingston, to other islands entirely. The economy was fundamentally altered. Without the concentrated mercantile community that had made Port Royal a hub of Caribbean trade, without the infrastructure of warehouses and counting houses and financial services, commerce began to flow elsewhere. And the pirates were gone. Not killed by the earthquake necessarily. The great age of buccaneering had already passed before June of 1692, but symbolically buried with the city that had sheltered them. The earthquake became, in retrospect, the period at the end of a sentence that had been trailing off for years. The wild era was over. The pirates and privateers who had made Port Royal infamous in the 1660s and 1670s were already dead, retired, reformed, or relocated by the time the ground opened. Henry Morgan was 4 years in his grave. Many of his lieutenants had died or moved on. The taverns and brothels and fencing operations still existed, but they existed as echoes, as habits, as the last traces of an economy that had already been superseded. What the earthquake did was make the transition visible. Before June 7th, 1692, you could still squint at Port Royal and see the pirate haven, the wild port, the city that had grown fat on plunder. After June 7th, that city was underwater. Whatever rose in its place was something else entirely. The theological response was immediate and, from certain perspectives, predictable. For generations afterward, for centuries really extending into the present, the destruction of Port Royal has been interpreted as divine judgment. The wicked city, the Sodom of the New World, had been struck down by God as punishment for its sins. The gambling, the prostitution, the drinking, the dealing in stolen goods, the fundamental lawlessness that had defined Port Royal for 3 decades, all of it had called down celestial wrath. The earthquake was not a geological event. It was a moral lesson. Dr. Heath, the rector who survived and documented, leaned into this interpretation. Of course he did. He was a clergyman. It was his job to find divine meaning in apparently random catastrophe. And the interpretation was not entirely self-serving. Many of the people who died or fled would have agreed with it, would have seen in the disaster a confirmation of warnings that preachers had been issuing for years. Port Royal had pushed its luck. Port Royal had lived as though consequences did not exist. Now consequences had come. But the theological reading, however comforting it might have been to those who wanted to believe that the universe operated according to comprehensible moral principles, had certain problems. One was that the earthquake did not discriminate. The wicked and the respectable had died together. Children had died alongside brothel keepers. The churches had sunk along with the taverns. Dr. Heath himself, a man who had presumably done nothing to deserve divine punishment, had barely escaped. If the earthquake was judgment, It was judgment of a peculiarly indiscriminate kind, the kind that made no distinction between the guilty and the innocent. Another problem was that the earthquake had struck at a time when Port Royal was, by its own standards, improving. The buccaneering era was over. The churches were being built. The courts were functioning. Morgan himself had spent his final years enforcing the law, not breaking it. If God was going to strike Port Royal, why not strike it in 1670, at the height of its wickedness? Why wait until the city was already reforming? These were questions that the theological interpreters did not spend much time on. Theodicy is not a pursuit that rewards excessive scrutiny. The interpretation hardened into received wisdom. Port Royal was destroyed for its wickedness. The story was too good, too neat, too satisfying to resist. It had narrative shape. It had a moral. It confirmed what respectable people wanted to believe about what happened to places that refused to be respectable. And it contained just enough truth. Port Royal was genuinely wicked. The earthquake did genuinely destroy it. That the interpretive leap from correlation to causation felt almost irresistible. The city that rose from the ruins was smaller, poorer, more cautious, twice more in the decades that followed. Fire would sweep through the rebuilt town in 1703 and 1704, destroying much of what had been reconstructed. Each time, the decision to rebuild was made. Each time, the rebuilt version was a little more diminished, a little more clearly a shadow of what had been. By the middle of the 18th century, Port Royal was primarily a naval base, home to the Royal Navy's Caribbean operations, important for strategic purposes, but no longer a center of commerce or population. The merchants had long since relocated to Kingston, which had grown into the major city that Port Royal had once threatened to become. The pirates had scattered to Nassau, to Madagascar, to wherever the next generation of maritime predators found space to operate. The earthquake had not ended piracy. The golden age of piracy, in fact, was still 30 years in the future when Port Royal sank, but it had ended Port Royal's role in that story. What remains still, is underwater. The sunken city sits on the floor of Kingston Harbor, one of the most significant underwater archaeological sites in the Western Hemisphere, a time capsule of late 17th century colonial life preserved by the same catastrophe that created it. Archaeologists have been working the site since the 1950s, recovering artifacts that range from mundane household goods to exquisite silver plate, from the pewter vessels of ordinary sailors to the elaborate clocks that ticked away the hours in counting houses that no longer exist. A pocket watch recovered from the site was stopped at 11:43, the moment the earthquake struck, frozen in place like a photograph of the catastrophe. The buildings are still there, beneath the water, not intact. Coral growth and centuries of decay and the disruption of the earthquake itself have taken their toll, but traceable. Foundations can be mapped, streets can be identified. The harbor floor contains a ghost city, a city that exists now only as outlines and artifacts, and the careful reconstructions of archaeologists who piece together what was from the fragments of what remains. The fragments tell stories that the documents cannot. A pewter spoon recovered from what was once a tavern floor carries the wear patterns of 1,000 meals, the handle worn smooth by the grip of hands that vanished in a single morning. A brass candlestick, green with centuries of submersion, once threw light across a room where men counted coins and negotiated prices and made decisions that shaped the flow of sugar and slaves across the Atlantic world. These objects do not moralize. They do not interpret. They simply exist. Evidence of ordinary life in an extraordinary place, testimony to the fact that Port Royal was not only a symbol or a warning or a parable, but also, before it was any of those things, a city where people lived. The archaeology reveals what the documentary record often obscures, the sheer ordinariness of much of Port Royal's daily existence. Yes, the taverns served their rum and the brothels their customers. Yes, the privateers came and went with holds full of plundered goods. But between the dramatic episodes, there were grocers selling vegetables, tailors stitching coats, coopers making barrels, chandlers supplying ships with the 1,000 small necessities of maritime life. There were children learning to read in the few schools that existed. There were servants sweeping floors, bakers lighting ovens, fishermen hauling nets in the harbor. The city that sank was a working city, a functioning society, not merely a theatrical set for pirates and prostitutes. The underwater excavations have recovered objects that speak to this broader life. Ceramic shards that can be traced to specific potteries in England and Holland, evidence of the consumer networks that connected Port Royal to the wider Atlantic world. Glass bottle fragments that contained not just rum but wine, medicine, ink, perfume, the full range of goods that any sophisticated 17th century population would have demanded. Bone remains from meals that included not just the expected tropical fish, but beef, pork, chicken, turtle, the diverse diet of a population with money to spend and tastes to satisfy. Port Royal ate well. Port Royal dressed well. Port Royal, whatever its moral reputation, was a city of appetites that extended far beyond the merely scandalous. The watch stopped at 11:43 has become iconic, but it is only one of many timepieces recovered from the site. Port Royal was a city that kept time. The counting houses needed to know when ships were expected, when notes came due, when the tides would turn. The merchants and factors who ran the island's economy were businessmen, whatever else they were. And business requires schedules, deadlines, coordination. The pocket watches and the elaborate table clocks that have been recovered speak to a society that understood time as a resource, that measured hours and minutes with the same precision it applied to weights of sugar and prices of slaves. This is perhaps the deepest irony of Port Royal's destruction. The earthquake lasted less than 3 minutes. The city that had measured its hours so carefully was unmade in the time it takes to boil an egg. All those clocks, all those watches, all those carefully calibrated instruments of temporal management, none of them could measure the speed at which everything ended. The watches that stopped at 11:43 became, in their stopping, the most accurate timekeepers of all. They recorded the one moment that actually mattered. The harbor floor preserves not only objects, but arrangements. The careful mapping of artifact locations allows archaeologists to reconstruct not just what Port Royal contained, but how it was organized. The distribution patterns of different types of goods reveal the social geography of the sunken city, where the wealthy merchants lived, where the ordinary tradesmen worked, where the taverns clustered, where the ships discharged their cargoes. A city can be read from its debris the way a text can be read from its fragments. Enough pieces, arranged with sufficient care, and the whole begins to reassemble itself. What emerges from this underwater reading is a city more complex than its legends allow. The residential quarters show signs of domestic comfort, decorative tiles, quality furniture fittings, the hardware of households that cared about appearance and permanence. These were not people who expected to live temporary lives in a temporary place. They invested in their homes. They accumulated possessions. They planned for futures that the earthquake would cancel. The legend of Port Royal emphasizes the transient nature of pirate wealth, the easy-come, easy-go mentality of men who spent their plunder as fast as they stole it. The archaeology suggests something different, a population that included many who were building, saving, establishing themselves in ways that contradicted the narrative of universal debauchery. This is not to deny the debauchery. The tavern districts have yielded their own evidence, the sheer concentration of drinking vessels, the pipe fragments that speak to the tobacco habit that gripped the 17th century Atlantic world, the dice and gaming pieces that confirm the reputation for gambling. The brothels have left fewer traces. Flesh does not preserve the way pewter does, and the material culture of prostitution is largely indistinguishable from the material culture of ordinary domestic life. But the concentration of taverns, the density of establishments selling drink and entertainment, the spatial clustering of vice, all of this is visible in the distribution patterns of the underwater record. What the archaeology cannot recover is the sound. The living city was loud. The harbor would have rung with the creak of ships' timbers, the slap of water against hulls, the shouts of stevedores and sailors, the clatter of carts on cobblestones. The streets would have carried the calls of vendors, the arguments of merchants, the laughter and cursing of men at liberty, the cries of children, the barking of dogs. Somewhere, always, a hammer was falling on metal, a saw was working through wood, a bell was calling someone to somewhere. Port Royal was a working city, and working cities make noise. The earthquake would have begun with a sound, a deep grinding rumble from beneath, a sound unlike anything the inhabitants had ever heard, and ended with a different kind of silence, the shocked quiet that follows catastrophe, broken only by screams and the settling of debris and the wash of the harbor waters over streets that had been dry land seconds before. The silence in the harbor now is the silence of centuries. Fish swim through spaces where men once walked. Coral grows on walls that once held paintings. The city that could not stop talking has been mute for over 300 years. But if the archaeology provides evidence, it does not provide explanation. Understanding what Port Royal was requires understanding what Port Royal meant, not to the moralizers who used its destruction as a sermon illustration, but to the people who built it, defended it, and profited from it. This requires stepping back from the underwater sight, back from the stopped watches and the pewter spoons, and asking a harder question. What was Port Royal for? What role did it play in the larger systems that created and sustained it? The answer lies in the nature of the 17th century Caribbean itself, the contested arc of islands that Europeans had been fighting over since Columbus first made landfall 2 centuries before. By the 1650s, when Port Royal began its rise, the Caribbean had become the most valuable real estate on Earth, not for its beauty, though the beauty was and is extraordinary, not for its climate, which Europeans found as often hostile as hospitable. The Caribbean mattered for a single reason: sugar. Sugar was, in the 17th century, what oil would become in the 20th. A commodity so valuable, so transformative, so central to the economy of the world that possessing the territory where it grew meant possessing wealth beyond the dreams of ordinary accumulation. The sugar islands of the Caribbean generated profits that exceeded those of entire European countries. A single successful sugar plantation could make its owner wealthier than most of the nobility. The flow of sugar from Caribbean islands to European markets and the counterflow of everything needed to produce it, enslaved labor, machinery, provisions, luxury goods for the planter class, constituted the largest commercial system the world had yet seen. Port Royal was a node in this system, not a sugar-producing site itself. Jamaica's plantation districts were inland, on the broader plains of the island's interior, but a processing point, a transshipment hub, a place where the products of the plantation economy were gathered, warehoused, and loaded onto ships bound for England. In this role, Port Royal was essential. The harbor's depth allowed the largest merchant vessels of the era to load directly from the wharves. The town's location at the harbor mouth gave it control over all traffic entering or leaving. Every hogshead of sugar that left Jamaica for Europe, every barrel of rum, every bag of pepper and ginger from the island's smaller but still significant spice trade, all of it passed through Port Royal. But sugar alone does not explain the pirates. Sugar was a legitimate trade, or as legitimate as any trade built on slave labor could claim to be. The sugar merchants were respectable, or aspired to respectability. They built their houses and attended their churches and married their daughters to men of standing. They would have been happy, most of them, to operate in a world where Port Royal was nothing more than a commercial port, a place of business rather than a place of excess. The pirates came because of something else. They came because Port Royal was located where it was, at the exact geographical point where 3 empires collided, and because that collision created opportunities that legitimate commerce could not. To understand this, look at a map of the 17th century Caribbean. The Spanish had claimed everything, but held only part of it. Their actual settlements concentrated on the larger islands, Cuba, Hispaniola, the mainland coasts of the Spanish Main, and on the ports from which the treasure fleets departed, Cartagena, Veracruz, Havana, Portobello. The smaller islands of the eastern Caribbean, the leeward and windward chains, the Spanish had largely ignored, finding them too small, too dry, or too difficult to defend. Into these gaps the English and French had moved, establishing colonies on islands like Barbados, Martinique, Guadeloupe, St. Kitts, colonies that produced sugar, needed labor, and resented Spanish pretensions to monopoly over Caribbean waters. Jamaica itself was a gap. The Spanish had held it since the early 16th century, but had never developed it seriously. No gold, no silver, and the indigenous population had been annihilated too quickly to provide an adequate labor force for agriculture. When Cromwell's expedition seized the island in 1655, they found a neglected outpost, lightly defended, more useful as a strategic location than as a productive territory. The Spanish had not wanted Jamaica badly enough to defend it. The English, once they had it, wanted it badly enough to make it the centerpiece of their Caribbean strategy. And that strategy, in the decades immediately following the conquest, was war. Not formal, declared war in the European style, though that happened often enough, but a constant, low-intensity conflict with Spanish shipping and Spanish settlements, carried on by forces that were not quite naval, not quite military, not quite criminal. The buccaneers. The buccaneers were the answer to a problem of state capacity. England, in the 1650s and 1660s, could not afford to maintain the naval presence necessary to defend Jamaica and harass Spanish shipping with purely official forces. The treasury was exhausted by civil war and its aftermath. The Royal Navy was stretched across multiple oceans. The Caribbean was too far, too expensive, too dangerous to be garrisoned in the conventional way. But there was another option. Let the defense and the harassment be conducted by private contractors, men who would work for a share of the profits rather than a naval salary, who would provide their own ships and crews, who would take the risks in exchange for a license to keep what they could steal. This was privateering, a practice as old as maritime warfare itself, and Port Royal became the premier privateering base in the Caribbean world. The licenses that governors issued, commissions they were called, or letters of marque, authorized the holders to attack Spanish shipping and settlements, to seize cargo and capture ships, to do everything that would have been piracy if done without official sanction. The distinction between privateer and pirate was in practice a piece of paper. The violence was the same. The business model was the same. The difference was that the privateer had a document that made him, in English law at least, a legal combatant rather than a criminal. Port Royal existed to process this violence. The privateering ships returned to harbor with their prizes, captured vessels sometimes that could be resold, cargo more often that needed to be inventoried, appraised, and divided according to the precise formulae that governed such distributions. The Admiralty Court sat in Port Royal to adjudicate these prizes, to determine their legality, to ensure that the Crown received its share and the investors theirs. The merchants who had financed the voyages waited in Port Royal's counting houses for the returns on their investment. The taverns and brothels that clustered around the harbor existed because men who had spent weeks or months at sea, risking their lives for a share of plunder, wanted somewhere to spend their earnings before the next voyage. It was a system, in other words, a system with rules, customs, institutions, expectations. The wildness of Port Royal was not simply license. It was the managed chaos that any economy generates where large amounts of money flow quickly through a concentrated population. The taverns were not merely places of debauchery, but places of business, where crews were recruited, where information was exchanged, where the next expedition was planned over rum and tobacco. The brothels served a function within the economy. The prostitutes were not outside the system, but part of it, extracting their share of the wealth that flowed through the city. Even the violence had its patterns. Fights happened, murders occurred, but the total breakdown of order that pure lawlessness would have produced did not happen because Port Royal was not actually lawless. It was differently lawful, governed by rules that respectable Europeans did not recognize, but that functioned well enough to keep the city operating. Henry Morgan understood this better than anyone. His career as a buccaneer captain was not a career of random violence, but of calculated predation, and Port Royal was essential to his calculations. When he needed to raise a fleet for the raid on Panama, the largest and most ambitious buccaneer operation ever conducted in the Caribbean, he did so in Port Royal, recruiting crews from the ships in harbor, negotiating shares with investors who expected returns, outfitting vessels from the chandleries and warehouses that lined the waterfront. When he returned, in triumph but also in potential legal jeopardy because the raid had technically violated a peace treaty, it was Port Royal's legal and commercial apparatus that processed his prizes, defended his actions, and eventually acquitted him of the charges that should, by strict interpretation of law, have sent him to the gallows. Morgan's subsequent career as lieutenant governor was not the ironic reversal it might seem. He understood Port Royal's system because he had operated within it. He knew which customs could be bent and which had to be enforced, which violations the city could absorb, and which threatened the delicate balance that kept commerce functioning. When he enforced the law against pirates in his later years, he was not betraying his former profession, but protecting it, ensuring that the privateering system retained enough legitimacy to continue operating, that the line between commissioned violence and criminal violence remained clear enough for English courts and English investors to maintain their involvement. This is the Port Royal that sank. Not a den of anarchic wickedness, but a functioning machine for the extraction and redistribution of Spanish wealth. A city that worked because it had evolved customs and institutions adequate to its peculiar situation. The earthquake did not destroy chaos. It destroyed a system, a vicious system, a brutal system, a system built on violence and exploitation and the traffic in human beings, but a system nonetheless with its own logic and its own rules and its own weird stability. The merchants who relocated to Kingston after the earthquake took the system's legitimate elements with them. The sugar trade continued. The slave trade continued. The commerce that had made Port Royal wealthy transferred itself over the following decades to the new location across the harbor, and Kingston grew into the city that Port Royal might have become if the earthquake had not intervened. But the privateering system did not transfer. It could not. The world that had created it was passing even before the earthquake struck. The Treaty of Madrid in 1670 had formally ended the English-Spanish conflict in the Caribbean. The buccaneers who had operated under commissions against Spanish shipping found their commissions revoked, their legal status uncertain, their way of life suddenly criminalized. Some, like Morgan, made the transition to respectability. Others drifted into outright piracy, attacking ships of any nation, operating without the legal cover that had protected them. The golden age of piracy that would flourish in the early 18th century was, in part, a consequence of this transition. Unemployed privateers becoming unemployed pirates, the skills and ships and institutional knowledge of Caribbean maritime violence adapting to new circumstances. But that age would find its centers elsewhere. Nassau, in the Bahamas, would become for a few years what Port Royal had been for a generation. A pirate haven, a base of operations, a place where the rules were different. Madagascar, on the far side of the world, would attract others. The Caribbean itself remained violent, remained contested, remained the site of continual conflict between European powers competing for the sugar wealth. But Port Royal's particular role, the nexus where privateering met commerce, where violence was licensed and processed and converted into legitimate wealth, that role passed into history. The earthquake accelerated a transition that was already underway. By 1692, Port Royal's great days were behind it. The buccaneering fleets no longer gathered in the harbor. Morgan was dead. The treaties that had ended the wars with Spain had removed the legal basis for privateering. The city was becoming what it would remain for the next century, a naval station, a minor port, a shadow of itself. The earthquake simply made the transition dramatic, gave it a narrative shape that the slower decline of gradual irrelevance would not have provided. This is why the moral interpretation was so appealing. It offered meaning where there was only accident. It transformed a geological event into a story, and stories satisfy in ways that mere events cannot. The city that defied God was struck down by God. The timing was wrong, the targeting was indiscriminate, the theology was shaky. But none of that mattered because the story worked. It had a beginning, Port Royal's rise to wickedness. It had a middle, Port Royal's increasing depravity and wealth. It had an end, divine punishment, swift and terrible, undeniable. What more could a sermon ask for? The truth, as always, is less satisfying. Port Royal was destroyed because it was built on sand and fell over an active fault line in a seismically active region. The liquefaction that consumed 2/3 of the city was a matter of physics, not theology. The timing was coincidence. The fault would have slipped when it slipped regardless of what the city above it was doing at the time. The children died alongside the sinners because earthquakes do not read census records or conduct moral evaluations. The churches sank with the taverns because they were built on the same unstable ground. But perhaps there's a different kind of meaning to be extracted, one that does not require supernatural intervention or moral causation. Port Royal was destroyed by the same forces that had created it. Not divine judgment, but something more fundamental. The basic instability of human arrangements built on exploitation and violence, the way such systems carry within themselves the seeds of their own undoing. The sandbar that made the harbor deep enough for the great ships also made the ground unstable enough to liquefy. The wealth that made the city worth building also made it worth building too quickly, too densely, too carelessly. The refusal of Port Royal's inhabitants to think about the future, a refusal that characterized the buccaneering ethos, the live-for-today mentality of men who might be dead next month, meant that they did not think about earthquake risks or building codes or what happened when you put brick structures on landfill over saturated sand. This is not theological. It is historical. It is the recognition that Port Royal's destruction was, in some sense, the completion of its logic. That a city built on plunder and speed and the assumption that there would always be more to take was not a city built to last. The earthquake did not punish Port Royal for being wicked. The earthquake simply revealed what had always been true, that Port Royal was fragile, that its prosperity was borrowed, that the ground beneath it was never as solid as it seemed. The survivors in those first hours existed in a state beyond shock. They moved through what remained of their city like sleepwalkers, their minds unable to process what their eyes were seeing. Where a street had been, there was now water. Where a building had stood, there was now a gap filled with debris and bodies and the churning of waves that should not have been there. The air smelled of salt and dust and something else, something organic and terrible that would grow worse in the coming days. And the sounds were perhaps worst of all. The groaning of structures that had not yet finished falling, the slap of water against brick that had never been meant to touch the sea. And underneath it all, intermittently, the cries of those who were still trapped, still alive, still hoping for rescue that might or might not come. The immediate dead numbered in the thousands. The precise count would never be established. Port Royal's record-keeping was indifferent at the best of times, and the earthquake had destroyed most of the parish registers along with everything else. Later estimates would range from 2,000 to 5,000 killed in the initial event, but these were guesses built on guesses, attempts to quantify what could not truly be quantified. What was certain was the scale. In a city of perhaps 7,000 souls, the majority were either dead, dying, or displaced within the span of those 2 catastrophic minutes. The survivors were now a minority in a landscape of ruin. The first priority for those capable of action was rescue. Men began digging through rubble with their hands, pulling at brick and timber to reach voices calling from beneath. Some successes occurred. People dragged from collapsed buildings, injured but alive, blinking in the sunlight at a world transformed. But for every rescue, there were a dozen failures, a dozen instances where the digging revealed only crushed bodies or where the voices went silent before help could arrive. The liquefied zones were worst. There was no digging through water. Those who had sunk into the saturated sand were simply gone, swallowed by the very ground they had walked on moments before, and no amount of effort could retrieve them. The harbor presented its own horror. The wave that had followed the earthquake, not a true tsunami but a surge caused by the subsidence of the shoreline and the displacement of water from the collapsing seabed, had swept ships from their moorings and deposited them in improbable locations. The frigate Swan, which had been undergoing careening at the time of the quake, was lifted by the surge and carried over the rooftops of the submerged waterfront, coming to rest hundreds of yards from where it had begun. Other vessels were less fortunate, smashed against buildings or against each other, their crews drowned or crushed in the chaos. The harbor itself was transformed, shallower in some places where debris had accumulated, deeper in others where the seabed had dropped. Navigation would be treacherous for weeks until the new configuration could be mapped. And then there were the bodies in the water. They began surfacing within hours, rising from the submerged streets as the gases of decomposition began their work. In the tropical heat, this process was accelerated. By the afternoon of the first day, corpses were floating in what had been Fort Street, what had been Thames Street, what had been the commercial heart of the richest city in the English Americas. The survivors who remained had to navigate past these bodies to reach each other, to reach what supplies could be salvaged, to reach anything resembling safety. Some of the bodies were recognizable: friends, neighbors, business partners, enemies. Most were not. The sea and the collapse in the first stages of decay had already begun their transformation. The response of the surviving colonial authorities was as organized as circumstances permitted, which is to say, barely organized at all. The acting governor, the council members who had survived, the military officers who still had commands to give. These men attempted to impose some structure on the chaos, but their resources were minimal, and the scale of the disaster was beyond anything they had imagined possible. Martial law was declared not so much to control the population as to prevent the complete breakdown of order that seemed imminent. Armed patrols were organized to prevent looting, though this proved difficult given that much of what might be looted was now underwater, and that many of those doing the looting were the same men who were supposed to be preventing it. The looting began almost immediately, and it would continue for days. Port Royal had been a city of extraordinary concentrated wealth, and not all of that wealth had sunk with the buildings that housed it. Coins spilled from broken strongboxes, silver plate emerged from collapsed walls. The bodies themselves yielded rings, watches, jewelry, the portable wealth that Port Royal's inhabitants had carried on their persons. Some of this was recovery, men salvaging their own property or the property of dead family members. Much of it was theft, the same acquisitive impulse that had built the city now manifesting in its ruins. Survivors later reported seeing men cutting fingers from corpses to retrieve rings more quickly, hacking at bodies to get at purses still tied to belts. Whether these reports were accurate or exaggerated, whether they represented common behavior or exceptional cases seized upon to justify the divine judgment narrative, cannot be determined. What is certain is that the destruction of Port Royal did not instantly transform its inhabitants into saints. The city's ethos survived the city itself, at least for a time. The wounded presented an almost unsolvable problem. In the initial hours, there were hundreds of people with serious injuries, broken bones, crush wounds, lacerations, burns from the fires that had broken out in the tumbled buildings. The physicians who had practiced in Port Royal were dead, fled, or overwhelmed. Medical supplies were buried, waterlogged, or simply insufficient to address the scale of need. Surgical instruments sat at the bottom of what had been High Street. Medicines were locked in dispensaries that no longer existed. What treatment was available was improvisational at best. Splints made from broken furniture, bandages torn from salvaged cloth, amputations performed without anesthetic by men whose medical training was limited to the battlefield expedients of naval surgeons. Many of the wounded died in those first hours and days, not from their initial injuries, but from the complications that followed. Infection was inevitable given the conditions: open wounds exposed to seawater, mud, decomposing organic matter, the biblical abundance of bacteria that thrived in Port Royal's tropical climate. Gangrene set in with terrifying speed. Men who had seemed salvageable in the immediate aftermath were dead within 3 days, their flesh blackening, their fevers spiking, their minds departing before their bodies followed. The survivors who served as impromptu medical staff could do little beyond providing comfort and, occasionally, the mercy of a faster death. The children, somehow, were the hardest. Port Royal had not been a family city in its early decades, but by 1692 it had developed a resident population that included wives and children, the beginnings of genuine community rather than mere transient enterprise. These children died alongside their parents, or without their parents, or survived to find themselves orphaned in a ruined city with no structures remaining to care for them. Contemporary accounts mention children wandering the rubble searching for parents who would never be found, children sitting beside bodies too young to understand what death meant, children adopted informally by surviving families who had space for one more. The earthquake did not discriminate by age, and neither did its aftermath. As the first day gave way to the first night, a new terror emerged. The darkness was almost absolute. Port Royal had been a well-lit city by the standards of its time, its streets illuminated by lanterns, its windows glowing with candles and oil lamps. Now there was nothing. The lanterns had fallen and broken, the candles had burned and not been replaced, the oil had spilled and caught fire and consumed itself. What light remained came from the fires still burning in the rubble and from the moon and stars above, but these were insufficient to illuminate a landscape that had become lethally treacherous. Survivors huddled in what shelter they could find, afraid to move in the darkness, afraid of what the darkness might contain. The sounds of the night were terrible. The continued groaning of unstable structures, the splash of things falling into water, the occasional cry of someone in distress, and, as the hours passed, the first sounds of the animals that had survived and were now scavenging. Dogs, rats, crabs emerging from the harbor in numbers that later accounts described as biblical. The second day brought worse. The Caribbean sun rose on June 8, 1692, to illuminate fully what the earthquake had done, and in that light the survivors could see clearly what the darkness had hidden. The bodies were bloating now, expanding in the heat, their features distorting, their flesh beginning to liquefy. The smell was becoming unbearable, the sweetish, cloying odor of human decomposition, mingled with the salt of the sea and the smoke of still-burning fires and the general rot of organic matter exposed to tropical heat. Flies had arrived in vast numbers, settling on everything, moving from corpse to corpse, from wound to wound, carrying disease with them in their wanderings. The decision was made, by whom precisely the records do not say, to begin disposing of the bodies as quickly as possible. There was no time for proper burial, no space in the rubble-strewn remnants of the churchyards, no labor available for the digging of hundreds of individual graves. The bodies were gathered instead and taken to the water's edge, weighted with stones or bricks, and pushed into the harbor. The sea that had risen to claim so much of Port Royal now received its dead, though it did not keep them. Bodies resurfaced over the following days and weeks, drifting with the currents, washing up on shores as far as 10 miles distant. The sharks, drawn by blood and decomposition, congregated in the harbor in numbers that the survivors found obscene. They fed openly on the floating dead, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop them. Disease followed death, as it always does in such circumstances. By the third day, the first cases of what survivors called the flux appeared. Dysentery, most likely, transmitted through water contaminated by the bodies and sewage that now saturated the flooded portions of the city. The flux killed with terrible efficiency, stripping fluid from bodies already weakened by shock and injury and exposure. Men who had survived the earthquake and its immediate aftermath, who had escaped falling buildings and drowning and the collapse of the sand beneath their feet, now died squatting in what rubble remained, their bowels emptying in violent spasms, their bodies unable to retain the water they desperately needed. Other diseases followed, their names uncertain from this distance, their symptoms recorded only in fragments. Fevers that came on suddenly and killed within days. Infections that spread from wounds that had seemed minor. Conditions that the 17th century had no name for, but that we might recognize as sepsis, as pneumonia, as typhoid, as the dozen opportunistic killers that thrive when human bodies are stressed and human communities are shattered. The death toll from disease in the weeks following the earthquake may have equaled or exceeded the death toll from the earthquake itself. The records are fragmentary, but they suggest that for every person who died in those 2 minutes of destruction, another died in the days and weeks that followed, killed not by falling buildings or rising water, but by the invisible predators that such catastrophes inevitably release. Those who could leave did. In the days following the earthquake, a steady stream of survivors made their way across the harbor to Kingston, the settlement on the mainland that had been founded just 5 years earlier. Kingston had felt the earthquake. How could it not? But being built on more stable ground, it had suffered far less damage. Its buildings still stood, its streets were still passable, its water was still drinkable. Port Royal's refugees arrived there in boats, on makeshift rafts, swimming when no other option presented itself, and Kingston absorbed them as best it could. The town had been small before June 7th, a minor satellite to Port Royal's commercial sun. In the weeks that followed, It became the de facto center of English Jamaica, not through any plan or ambition, but simply through the accident of survival. The transfer of power was gradual but irreversible. The colonial government, recognizing that Port Royal could no longer function as a capital, began moving its operations to Kingston. The merchants who had survived the earthquake and who had the resources to rebuild chose to rebuild on the mainland rather than return to the sandbar that had betrayed them. The Royal Navy, which had used Port Royal as its Caribbean base, began the process of establishing new facilities across the harbor. Within a year, Kingston would be the capital, in fact, if not yet in name. Within a decade, it would be the commercial center of Jamaica, the port through which the island's sugar flowed to the world. Port Royal's role would shrink to what the geography had always made it suitable for: a naval station, a minor harbor, a place of strategic rather than commercial significance. But in those first days and weeks, such futures were unimaginable. The survivors could see only the immediate catastrophe, the overwhelming present tense of death and disease and destruction. They had lost their city, their livelihoods, their families, their sense of what was possible. The ground itself had proved treacherous, the solid earth beneath their feet revealed to be nothing more than a temporary arrangement, a fiction that could be revoked without warning. How do you rebuild when you can no longer trust the ground? How do you plan for the future when the future has revealed itself capable of such total rupture? The survivors dealt with these questions in different ways. Some turned to religion, finding in the earthquake confirmation of what the preachers had always said, that God was watching, that God was judging, that the wages of sin was death, and Port Royal had been paid in full. These survivors understood the earthquake as a message, and the message was, change your ways. They prayed with new fervor. They attended what services could be organized in the ruins. They interpreted their survival as a second chance, a divine reprieve that came with the obligation of reformation. Whether this reformation was genuine or temporary, whether it lasted or faded as the shock receded, the records do not say. Others turned to drink, to the same rum and punch that had fueled Port Royal's legendary debauchery. The taverns were destroyed, but liquor could be salvaged, distilled, traded, consumed. In the weeks following the earthquake, observers noted that drunkenness was rampant among the survivors, that men were drinking not to celebrate but to forget, not to enhance experience but to dull it. This, too, was a kind of response to the unthinkable, perhaps a more honest one than the religious revival, an acknowledgement that some things cannot be processed, cannot be integrated, can only be escaped. The morning would come eventually, and with it the hangover and the unchanged reality of ruin. But for the hours of intoxication at least, the mind could go elsewhere. And some turned to work, to the practical tasks of salvage and reconstruction and simple survival. These were the people who kept the remnants of Port Royal functioning in the weeks after the disaster, the men who organized the burial details, who patrolled against looting, who established distribution points for whatever food and water could be found. They were not necessarily better or worse than the praying survivors or the drinking survivors. They were simply responding to the same impossible situation with a different set of tools, a different way of coping. Work was its own kind of forgetting, its own kind of meaning-making. If you could not understand what had happened, you could at least dig out the rubble. If you could not bring back the dead, you could at least feed the living. The colonial administration, such as it was, struggled to maintain coherence. Acting Governor White himself, shaken by the disaster, attempted to organize relief efforts and maintain order, but his resources were laughable relative to the need. Ships were dispatched to other islands requesting supplies, food, medicine, temporary shelter, the basic necessities of survival. Some help arrived, most did not, or arrived too late to matter. The other English colonies had their own concerns, their own limited resources, their own reluctance to pour aid into a ruined city that might never recover. Port Royal would have to save itself, or not be saved at all. The physical work of recovery continued through June and into July. Bodies were still being found weeks after the earthquake, pulled from rubble or washed up on distant shores or discovered in the hulks of submerged buildings. The stench of decomposition hung over the harbor for months, a constant reminder of what had happened and how many had died. The flooded portions of the city remained flooded. There was no mechanism to pump them dry, no will to reclaim land that had already proved itself untrustworthy. The underwater streets became a kind of open grave, a memorial to the vanished city, visited occasionally by divers who reported seeing buildings still standing beneath the waves, their contents preserved in the salt water, their former inhabitants long since consumed by fish and decay. On the surviving strip of land, some reconstruction occurred. Buildings were repaired, streets were cleared, a semblance of normal life resumed, but Port Royal would never again be what it had been. The confidence was gone, the swagger, the sense of invincibility, the belief that wealth and violence could build something permanent on the edge of empire. The survivors rebuilt cautiously, if they rebuilt at all, and many chose not to, chose instead to take whatever they could salvage and start over somewhere else, somewhere the ground did not swallow the living without warning. The exodus began almost immediately. In the days following the earthquake, even as bodies were still being pulled from the rubble and the dead were still being rolled into mass graves, the living were already leaving. They crowded onto whatever vessels remained afloat, merchant ships, small coastal craft, even the damaged Navy frigates that had survived the harbor wave. Some went to other Jamaican settlements, Spanish Town, which had been the island's original capital, and now became so again by default, or the smaller coastal towns that had escaped the worst of the destruction. Others left Jamaica entirely, dispersing to Barbados, to the Leeward Islands, to the North American colonies, to anywhere that was not Port Royal, anywhere the ground had not opened beneath their feet and swallowed everything they had built. The merchants went first, or at least the successful ones, the men with enough capital to relocate their operations and enough connections to establish themselves elsewhere. They took their ledgers, their correspondence networks, their carefully cultivated relationships with suppliers and buyers across the Atlantic world. They left behind warehouses full of goods, the salvage too dangerous, the investment already written off, and they started over in Kingston Harbor or Bridgetown or Boston, rebuilding their fortunes on foundations that had not yet failed them. For these men, Port Royal had been a means to an end, a mechanism for extracting wealth from the Caribbean trade. The mechanism was broken now, but the system it served remained intact. There were other mechanisms, other ports, other cities willing to play the role that Port Royal had played. Business would continue. Business always continued. The craftsmen followed, the carpenters and coopers and sailmakers and smiths who had served the maritime economy. Their skills were portable, needed everywhere ships sailed, and they had no particular attachment to Port Royal beyond the wages it had paid them. They loaded their tools onto departing vessels and went wherever work awaited. Some ended up in the growing settlements along the Jamaican coast, helping to build the infrastructure that would eventually make Kingston the island's dominant port. Others scattered across the Caribbean, finding employment in the shipyards and workshops of a dozen different colonies. They would tell their children about the earthquake, about the morning the city fell into the sea, and their children would tell their children, and eventually the story would become just another piece of family lore, another tale from the old days, no more real than any other story about places that no longer existed. The pirates went too, though their departure had begun even before the earthquake. By 1692, Port Royal's golden age of buccaneering was already ending, squeezed out by the changing political realities of the Caribbean. The wars that had justified the buccaneers, the conflicts between England and Spain that had made privateering profitable and quasi-legal, had cooled into an uneasy peace. The colonial administration, always ambivalent about its pirate allies, had begun to enforce the distinctions between legitimate commerce and outright robbery that it had previously ignored. Henry Morgan had been dead for 4 years, and with him had died a certain era, a certain understanding between the government and the men who sailed under black flags. The earthquake merely accelerated what was already happening, removing the physical infrastructure that had made Port Royal convenient and forcing the remaining buccaneers to seek other harbors, other arrangements. Where did they go? The records are fragmentary, the trails difficult to follow. Some sailed for the Bahamas, for Nassau, which would become in the early 18th century what Port Royal had been in the late 17th, a pirate haven, an ungoverned space, a city built on robbery and the tolerance of corrupt officials. Others went to Madagascar, to the Indian Ocean, where the Mughal shipping lanes offered rich prizes and the European naval presence was thin. Still others gave up piracy entirely, using whatever wealth they had accumulated to purchase respectability, to become planters or merchants or simply retired men of uncertain past, their violent histories quietly forgotten. The earthquake did not end piracy in the Caribbean. It merely shifted its geography, redistributed its practitioners, rearranged the map of lawlessness. The sea remained ungoverned. Only the ports changed, but not everyone left. Some survivors stayed, whether from poverty, from attachment, from simple stubbornness, the sources do not say. They remained on the narrow spit of land that had not fallen into the harbor, rebuilding what could be rebuilt, salvaging what could be salvaged, attempting to resurrect some version of the city they had known. Their efforts were not without success. Within a few years of the earthquake, Port Royal had regained a portion of its population, a fraction of its commerce, a shadow of its former activity. Ships still called at the harbor. Goods still moved through the warehouses. The taverns reopened, though there were fewer of them now, and they served a diminished clientele. The city lived, after a fashion. It simply did not thrive. And then came the fire. On January 9th, 1703, less than 11 years after the earthquake, a blaze broke out in Port Royal and swept through the rebuilt sections of the city with a speed that witnesses described as almost supernatural. The wooden structures that had replaced the brick buildings lost to the earthquake burned like kindling, the flames leaping from roof to roof faster than any bucket brigade could contain them. By the time the fire burned itself out, most of what the survivors had reconstructed was gone. The city had to be rebuilt again, and this time the will to do so was harder to summon. Once could be attributed to divine judgment or geological misfortune. Twice began to look like fate, like a message, like the universe making clear that Port Royal was not meant to exist. They rebuilt anyway, or some of them did. The city that emerged from the second reconstruction was smaller still, more cautious, stripped of the ambition that had characterized the original settlement. The warehouses were fewer and more modest. The taverns served sailors rather than pirates. The fortifications remained because fortifications were necessary in a contested Caribbean, but they guarded a diminished prize. Port Royal became what it had never been before, ordinary, a naval station, a minor port, a place ships stopped on their way to somewhere more important. The wildness was gone, burned out or drowned or simply exhausted by repeated catastrophe. The hurricanes came after that. The Caribbean has always been a landscape of hurricanes, and Port Royal, perched on its exposed sandspit at the harbor mouth, was peculiarly vulnerable to their passage. Major storms struck in 1712, in 1722, in 1726, each one tearing away more of what had been rebuilt, each one reminding the residents that they were living on borrowed time in a borrowed place. By the mid-18th century, Port Royal's population had dwindled to a few hundred permanent residents, mostly connected to the naval base that the British maintained there. The great city of the buccaneer age existed now only in memory and in the archaeological record accumulating beneath the harbor waters. The archaeology would come later, much later, in the 20th century, when divers began systematic exploration of the sunken portions of the city. What they found beneath the waves was remarkable. A time capsule, a frozen moment, the catastrophe preserved in the artifacts it had claimed. They recovered pocket watches stopped at the moment of the earthquake. 11:43 in the morning, as the historical accounts attested. They found pewter plates still holding the remains of meals that were being eaten when the shaking began. They discovered buildings still standing underwater, their walls intact, their contents scattered but identifiable. They pulled up clay pipes and rum bottles and broken pottery and brass buttons and all the ordinary detritus of 17th century Caribbean life, preserved in the anaerobic waters of Kingston Harbor, where the oxygen could not reach them and the decay could not complete its work. They found human remains as well, though fewer than expected, fewer than the death toll would suggest. The sea had been thorough in its consumption, and the bones that survived were fragmentary, partial, difficult to identify. But they found enough to confirm what the written sources described, that people had died here, in this place, on this morning, trapped by collapsing buildings or swallowed by liquefied sand, or drowned in the sudden inundation. The artifacts told their stories. A skeleton found clutching a money bag, the coins still inside, a man who had tried to save his wealth and had saved nothing. A brass sundial stopped at the hour of destruction, a tavern sign, the paint still visible, advertising a drinking establishment that had served its last drink 4 centuries ago. The underwater excavations revealed something else as well, something that complicated the simple morality tale that preachers had been telling since the day of the disaster. They revealed that Port Royal had been, in addition to everything else, a functioning city, a place where ordinary people had lived ordinary lives alongside the pirates and prostitutes and slave traders. They found children's toys and women's jewelry and household goods that spoke of domesticity, of families, of the daily routines of cooking and cleaning and caring for the young. They found workshops and counting houses and the tools of dozens of trades, the infrastructure of an economy that had served legitimate commerce as well as illegitimate. They found, in short, evidence that Port Royal had been human in ways that the moralizers had preferred to forget, not just a den of iniquity, but a community, with all the complexity that implies. This does not redeem the city. Nothing redeems Port Royal, or needs to. The slave markets operated. The violence was real. The wealth that built those fine brick houses came from robbery and the exploitation of human beings and the systematic brutality of the colonial enterprise. The earthquake did not kill the innocent and spare the guilty. It killed indiscriminately, as earthquakes do, as natural disasters always do. But the archaeological record complicates the story that contemporary observers wanted to tell, the story of divine judgment striking precisely where it was deserved. God, if he acted at Port Royal, did not discriminate between the slaver and the enslaved, between the pirate and the merchant he robbed, between the prostitute and the wife she served alongside. The earthquake was not justice, it was geology. The tectonic plates beneath Jamaica did not care about the moral condition of the people they destroyed. And yet the coincidence remained and remains almost too neat to accept as mere coincidence. The wickedest city in Christendom, the sudden destruction, the swallowing of the earth, the biblical parallels that every witness immediately recognized, the timing, just as the city reached the peak of its wealth and notoriety, just as its reputation as the Sodom of the New World had spread across 2 continents. Even now, even knowing what we know about plate tectonics and liquefaction and the particular geology of the Palisado's sand spit, it is difficult to tell the story of Port Royal without feeling the narrative pull of the morality tale, the sense that this was somehow meant, somehow significant, somehow more than the random intersection of human settlement and seismic activity. This is the trap that the earthquake set for everyone who has tried to write about it. The events themselves seem to demand a meaning. The destruction was so complete, so sudden, so perfectly targeted at a city that seemed to deserve destruction that pure contingency feels inadequate as an explanation. And so the writers have tried to impose meanings, divine judgment, historical inevitability, moral lessons about pride and excess and the wages of sin. But the meanings never quite fit. Port Royal was not uniquely wicked. It was simply the wickedness of the Caribbean trade concentrated in one convenient location. The earthquake was not unique to Port Royal. Jamaica sits on a fault zone and had experienced tremors before and would experience them again. The destruction, however catastrophic, was ultimately the result of building a city on unsuitable ground in a seismically active region, a decision made for practical rather than moral reasons and punished by geology rather than theology. Perhaps this is the only meaning available, that Port Royal teaches us nothing except what we already know, that the universe does not arrange itself according to human narratives, that coincidences are just coincidences even when they are spectacular, that cities fall and people die, and history continues with sublime indifference to the lessons we try to extract from it. The preachers who saw divine judgment were not wrong because they were preachers. They were wrong because they were human, because they could not resist the impulse to make sense of the senseless, to impose pattern on chaos, to believe that the catastrophe meant something beyond its own awful particularity. Port Royal meant nothing. It simply was. A city rose on a sand spit. It grew rich on trade and violence and slavery. An earthquake struck. The city fell. The survivors rebuilt, and fire destroyed what they built. They rebuilt again, and hurricanes destroyed what they built. Eventually, they stopped rebuilding, or rebuilt so modestly that the city became something else entirely, a shadow of its former self, a naval station, a fishing village, a place where archaeologists came to study the past. The story has no moral except the one we bring to it. The meaning is ours to impose or not. The facts do not require our interpretation. They simply wait beneath the harbor water, preserved in the dark, silent as the dead. Today, if you travel to Jamaica and find your way to the tip of the Palisados, you will find Port Royal still there. Or rather, you will find something called Port Royal, a small fishing community of perhaps 1,000 residents, quiet and unremarkable, surrounded by the ghosts of the city it replaced. The streets are narrow and peaceful. The buildings are low and weathered. There is a church, built and rebuilt again across 3 centuries, and a small maritime museum, and the remains of Fort Charles, where Nelson once stood watch, and where the earthquakes of 1692 and 1907 left visible damage that has never been fully repaired. There is a harbor where small boats bob at anchor, where the water is green and shallow, where, if you know where to look, you can still make out the outlines of submerged structures beneath the surface, the bones of the old city, still waiting, still preserved, still holding their secrets 4 centuries after the morning the ground opened beneath them. The living city ignores the dead one, for the most part. The fishermen cast their nets over the ruins without much thought for what lies beneath. The tourists come and go, snapping photographs, buying souvenirs, hearing the story of the earthquake from guides who have told it 1,000 times. The archaeologists come too, less often now than in the excavation's heyday, but still occasionally, still pulling artifacts from the underwater city, still adding to our knowledge of what Port Royal was and how it lived and how it died. The work continues. The work always continues. There is always more to know, more to recover, more to preserve before the salt water finally completes its patient destruction. And the sea rises. This is the final chapter. The chapter not yet written, the ending that Port Royal has not yet reached but is inexorably approaching. Climate change is lifting the waters of Kingston Harbor millimeter by millimeter, year by year, and the narrow strip of land that survived the earthquake is narrowing further, losing ground to the same ocean that claimed the original city. The archaeologists work with increasing urgency, aware that their window for excavation is closing, that the preserved portions of the sunken city may not remain preserved much longer as wave action and chemical change and simple entropy complete what the earthquake began. There may come a day, not soon perhaps, but eventually, when even the surviving fragment of Port Royal disappears, when the sand spit subsides entirely beneath the Caribbean, when the wickedest city in Christendom becomes nothing more than a shallow spot in a harbor, a hazard on nautical charts, a memory fading into legend. The buccaneers are long dead. The merchants are long dead. The enslaved people who labored in their warehouses are long dead. The survivors who fled, the children they raised, the grandchildren and great-grandchildren who carried the story forward, all of them are dead now, folded back into the earth they came from, their bones scattered across 3 continents, their names largely forgotten. The written records survive, fragmentary and biased, telling us what the literate observers thought was worth preserving, silent about everything else. The archaeological record survives, more democratic in its way, preserving the pocket watch and the pewter plate alongside the merchant's ledger, the slave's shackles alongside the governor's correspondence. But even the archaeological record is partial, selective, shaped by what the earthquake happened to preserve and what the excavators happened to find. Port Royal resists our understanding even as it demands our attention. It was too important to ignore. The wealthiest city in the English Americas, the epicenter of Caribbean piracy, the place where Henry Morgan made his fortune and built his legend. And its destruction was too spectacular to dismiss. An entire city falling into the sea in under 3 minutes, a catastrophe of biblical proportions witnessed by survivors who left detailed accounts. The story insists on being told, but every telling is partial, every interpretation contested, every meaning proposed immediately undermined by the complexity of the evidence and the ambiguity of the facts. What remains, finally, is this: a name, a location, a date, Port Royal, Kingston Harbor, June 7th, 1692. And beneath the green water of the harbor, the ruins of a city that existed for less than 40 years and shaped the Caribbean for centuries. The forts where the buccaneers anchored, the warehouses where the looted treasure was stored, the taverns where the pirates drank, and the brothels where they spent their money. All of it resting now in the silt and the silence, preserved and destroyed at once, waiting for the divers who will never recover all of it, holding its secrets in the darkness of the deep. The wickedest city in Christendom, the Sodom of the New World, the city that the earth swallowed and the sea keeps. It has been waiting for more than 300 years now, patient as the tides, quiet as the dead. And somewhere beneath the water, in a counting house or a tavern or a brothel that no one has yet found, there is a pocket watch with its hands frozen at 11:43 in the morning, still marking the moment when everything changed, still telling the time in a city that time forgot. The living walk above, unknowing. The sea remembers.